All right, well, if you're new, welcome. We have been studying, working our way through the Gospel of John, really answering the question, who is Jesus? It's a book that was written by one of, if not Jesus' closest friends. And I think perhaps the best way for me to introduce chapter 7 is by showing you a map. We're going to draw the lens back a little bit and give you the larger context of where we're at in the life of Jesus. So go ahead and let's put that map up there. This is the area essentially the places where Jesus has been traveling over the last 2 years. So let me explain it to you. For the last year or so in the text, he's been in the area of Galilee to the north. And the reason why he moved from the south, that area of Judea, see where Jerusalem is, that's where he was for a time, but then he moved to the north. And the reason why he made that move is because the religious leaders are out to get him. They think he's a phony, they think he's a fraud, and they're spreading all kinds of false things about Jesus. They have their eye on him. Essentially, they want him dead. And so he escapes out from underneath their watchful eye, travels up north. He's been doing all kinds of ministry in the region of Galilee, which includes feeding several thousand people, very public ministry, one in which all these people participate in, walks on water, and then at the height of his popularity, he drops this on everybody. With thousands following him, he says, I'm about to call you all to a deeper commitment. This isn't just about feeding your bellies and having you observe supernatural works. This is about having your life transformed from the inside out. And so he makes this statement, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me. And people are left going, excuse me? Excuse me? It was a deeper call to commitment. In other words, metaphorically, Jesus is saying, unless you take my life into your own, you really have no part of me. And of course, this is not what many people wanted to hear. The text literally says that many of his disciples were with him no more. They were down for the free food and the supernatural acts, but the commitment, they weren't about that. So Jesus is about to head from the area of Galilee, again, where he's been ministering for about a year, down south to the area of Judea and Jerusalem. And probably the best way for me to describe chapters 7 and 8 is by using two words: escalating hatred. Escalating hatred. The Pharisees, they haven't let up. In fact, when Jesus was to the north, they sent spies. And everything they believe has been confirmed according to those spies. Jesus is a blasphemer. Now, Jesus is on his way back to Jerusalem. They're waiting for him. The stage is set that will ultimately lead to this massive collision that will culminate in Jesus going to the cross. John chapter 7, verse 1, it's on the back of your notes. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. The this refers to what we read earlier in chapters 5 and 6. He's been spending a lot of time there ministering to the people, explaining that he comes from God. He would not go about in Judea, that area to the south, because the Jews, think of the Jewish religious leaders, were seeking to kill him. Now, Jesus isn't a coward. This is a timing issue, and we'll see that in a second. Now, the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand. This is one of three major Jewish celebrations. If you were to travel to the city of Jerusalem back in this day, the population would swell in attendance. Feast of Booths. It was a time to remember God's faithfulness to the ancient Israelites when he led them through the wilderness. The word booths means tent. So you would see these pilgrims ascending on Jerusalem, and they would be staying in tents, just like the good old days when we stayed in tents during the wilderness wanderings. That's what we're commemorating with this festival. And so that's what would be happening in Jerusalem at this time. So his brothers, verse 3, said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And then we get this statement, verse 5. For not even his brothers believed in him. Wow. Did you catch that? His own brothers did not believe that he was the Messiah. At least not yet. James, one of his brothers, we call them half-brothers because Jesus was begotten of the Holy Spirit. One of his brothers, James, will go on to believe. He will become persuaded that Jesus is who he said he was. He'll write a New Testament book. It's there, the book of James. But for now, his own family isn't buying it. Later they will. James will. In fact, James will actually refer to Jesus as his Lord, as Christos, the Messiah. Now, I have 3 brothers. Never once has any of them ever referred to me as Lord or Master or Messiah. And with good reason. They never will. Now, I'm a pretty good guy, but they're never going to refer to me in that way. Something happened that changed the mind and heart of James completely and totally. And he says, Jesus is more than a brother to me. He's my master. He's my Lord. He's my Savior. Brothers don't talk like this about brothers unless you have good reason to. What could possibly be that good reason? There's only one reasonable explanation, and that is James, along with the others, many others, saw the resurrected Jesus, and they believed he did it. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. Therefore, he is who he said he was. And it completely and totally changes their lives. The disciples were cowards. They abandoned Jesus upon his arrest leading up to his crucifixion. Peter, one of his closest followers, denied Jesus 3 times. Something happened that transformed the lives of these men, moving them from cowards to martyrs, willing to die for their belief, their faith in Jesus. It was because they too saw the resurrected Jesus. But for now, Jesus' own family members, they're like, we're not buying it. But if you are who you say you are, leave Galilee. Leave these podunk little cities in Galilee and go to the big time. Go to the bright lights, the big city. Go to Jerusalem. Show yourself there. Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come. It's not my time it's not about me showing off. My time involves my death. That's what Jesus was referring to, because he knows when he takes the trip back to Jerusalem, it's only a matter of time. This escalating hatred culminates in his crucifixion. He says, it's not my time. But your time is always here. The world cannot hate you. It's an interesting statement. The world cannot hate you, he says to his brothers, but it hates me because I testify about it. To testify is to speak. He says, here's what I say. The world's works are evil. We'll talk more about that in a second. So you go up to the feast, verse 8. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. So it was Jesus' plan to go, but not in the way that his brothers wanted him to go. He goes unannounced, not to draw attention to himself. Verse 11, the Jews were looking for him at the feast. They got their eyes out for him, these Jewish religious leaders. Where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. Some said, he's a good man. Others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, those religious leaders, no one spoke openly of him. So the rumors about Jesus are flying now back in Jerusalem. Major first century celebrity Jesus is. And the reviews are mixed. According to Matthew chapter 27, what we learn is that the Pharisees are the ones who are trying to persuade the people to believe that Jesus is a fraud. He's a con man. He's not who you think he is. The challenge for them is that back up in Galilee, you got a whole lot of people, literally thousands, that had a very positive impression of Jesus. So you have this mixed response in the crowd, but yet the religious leaders have such an overwhelming influence on everybody. Those who do have a positive impression of Jesus are kind of like, I'm not saying anything. If I speak positively of Jesus, it's going to be really bad for me from the religious leaders. So they remain silent. I was listening to a podcast. It was really interesting. It was essentially a roundtable discussion with a group of atheists. A couple of them were fairly well known. And to their credit, they could not dismiss the fact that Jesus was a real historical person. Essentially, no reputable historian will doubt the existence of a Jesus of Nazareth. But of course, they went on to doubt that he was the Son of God, God in the flesh. And for that claim, they labeled him delusional. At the same time, they applauded his compassion and his morality and his goodness. Kind of interesting. The challenge is that Jesus didn't leave that as an option. He didn't say, hey, I'm on the scene, and if you accept me as being a good and compassionate teacher, that's okay. He didn't leave it at that. He was constantly saying things like, I come from God, and my words are his words. And so if you don't listen to me, it's like you're not listening to God. And he would say things like, I am the only way to the Father. You can't get to heaven except through me. And there are people that just didn't want to hear that, specifically the leaders. They didn't want to hear that. And for this, they wanted him crucified. So there's this collision course, and it continues to escalate with verse 14. About the middle of the feast is about 7 days long, so 2 or 3 days into it, Jesus went up into the temple, and he begins to teach. Jesus would have had the appearance of a rabbi. This would be a natural thing for him to do. However, verse 15, the Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this guy is educated and he has learning and he's never studied? This is an obvious question to these guys back in the day because rabbis were well known. The best rabbis were like superstars. Even today, if you visit Jerusalem and parts of the old city, you can buy paintings, portraits of modern day rabbis. In fact, these guys are so popular that if you're in the old city, you can identify who follows what particular rabbi by the style of hat that they wear. The students or the disciples of the rabbis wear different hats, different shapes and sizes. And by looking at that, you say, oh, okay, I know what rabbi you follow. He wears the same hat you wear. And that's just how it is. The major celebrities, so back in the day, they're looking at Jesus as a rabbi and like, hey, wait a second. We know this guy. We know his background, okay? Everything Jesus did from a worldly perspective just wasn't right. Wrong lineage, right? I mean, he's born to 2 teenage peasant parents, born in the podunk town of Bethlehem, raised in the backwater village of Nazareth, and now we see him teaching. And here's the problem. It's like, wait a minute. This guy's got authority. This guy seems educated. Where did he get such learning? Even Paul, when he lays down his street cred and he says, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I counted myself one of the greatest Hebrews that was out. I was on the fast track to becoming the next great rabbi because I studied under Gamaliel. And everybody's like, whoa, Gamaliel? He chose you? That Gamaliel was the man. He's like the master rabbi. He chose you, Paul? Wow, that's something special. Meanwhile, they look at Jesus like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? Well, let me tell you something. This guy teaches with authority, and he's learned. He's learned. So Jesus responds, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. There he goes again, claiming this direct line to God. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Wow, it's a big statement. What he's saying is, if you don't accept my teaching as being from God, then you're outside the will of God. You don't know the will of God. So all of you who claim to know the will of God, if you reject my teaching, you're rejecting God. It's a big statement. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. So Jesus responds to, hey, who are you? Where are you from? Is this. My credentials are this. I'm from God. Therefore, just pay attention to my doctrine because my doctrine speaks for itself. And what he does next is he addresses a major problem that's still lingering for him and the religious leaders. Previously, when he was in Jerusalem, he heals a man on the Sabbath. And the religious leaders look at Jesus and say, we knew it. You violated the commandment of Moses. And Moses says, on the Sabbath, no work should be done. And then what they did was they said, now we will help you understand what it means not to do any work. One of the works that you don't do is the work of healing. So if you were sick on the Sabbath, you couldn't go to the doctor. You had to wait till the day after. And so what does Jesus do? He heals a man on the Sabbath. And they look at him and they say, oh, we knew it. We knew it. You should have saved that healing for the next day. That guy should have remained lame and crippled until the next day. He's not from God. He violates the Sabbath. He's not a follower of Moses. And so Jesus responds with this. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Oh my. Oh. I mean, if you could just be there to see this. These are the guys that just like, the law just like oozed out of them. And now Jesus says, you don't keep the law. So why do you seek to kill me? Now the crowd doesn't completely understand what's going on yet. They respond, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Well, the Jewish leaders are like, we are. Jesus answered them, I did one work. I healed a man on the Sabbath, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. It says, but it didn't start with Moses, it started before Moses, Abraham. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. Now, not to sound weird, but to help you understand, circumcision was sort of the badge of honor for every good Jewish male. In fact, ancient rabbis had a belief that Abraham was positioned outside the gates of heaven, and it was his job to inspect every male to make sure he was circumcised. Otherwise, he wasn't going to get into heaven. That's how fierce, that was their attachment to circumcision. It was like, this is our identifying characteristic that we are God's people, circumcision. And Jesus says, you actually perform circumcisions on the Sabbath. Lawbreaker. Lawbreaker. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. So, now you know why Jesus was hated. There's this ongoing direct conflict with these rulers. And Jesus says, you've judged me wrongly. They hated him. They hated him. Why? Verse 7, he pinpoints it. He says, here's why I'm hated. To his brothers he says, I'm hated because I testify about the works of the world and that they are evil. What does that mean? What does that mean that the works of the world are evil? You have to understand that the word world is used in two different ways. I'll show you what I'm talking about. John 3:16 says this. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Most famous verse in the entire Bible. What to say? God loved the world. That same author, John, in 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world. Okay, now I'm a little confused. Or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not him. So do we not love the world? I mean, God loved the world. Do we not love the world? I mean, what's going on? If we love the world, the love of God is not in us. But I thought we read earlier that God loved the world. So what's going on here? The word world in John 3:16 refers to people. God loves people. And so we are commanded to love people. But the word world in the second verse refers to something completely different. It refers to the world's system, the world's way of thinking, what the world values. You say, well, help me flesh that out a little bit. That's exactly what John does in the very next verse. 1 John chapter 2, verse 16 says this, for all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. You say, what does that mean? Desires of the flesh, boastful pride of life. What is that talking about? Let me put it to you simply. A modern day way of saying it is this. If it looks good, get it. If it feels good, pursue it. And if it has anything to do with you being made to feel like you're the man or you're the woman, go after it. Anything that fuels your sense of pride or ego, pursue it. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. Now, what John is saying is that this is the gas. This is what fuels the flesh. And can we please be honest for a moment? This isn't even up for debate. This one's not even up for debate, folks. An online article recently appeared with this title, Porn, the most silently used word in the world. As many of you already know, probably, the porn industry's net worth is closing in on $100 billion. Pornography generates more revenue than the NBA, the NFL, and Major League Baseball combined. One of the more popular porn websites has more traffic in a month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. Last week, Pastor Chris and I, we listened to a live talk given by a man who specializes in the treatment of sexual addiction and pornography. And when he was finished, I asked a question. I said, clearly, the future of porn is virtual reality. A couple weeks ago, I read an article written by a pastor, and he got to experience the world of virtual reality. And I think it was a visit to Google or something like that. And so he writes about it, and it was amazing to read what he wrote. He said, after the experience, it was really difficult for my brain to discern. And I had to kind of try to remind myself over and over that it was virtual reality, because the memories and the impression, it was just so real. The experience was so real. And so I asked him, I said, since that's the future, how is that going to impact pornography? And he said, I don't know. What do you think? And I said, I think it's going to throw gas on what's already a raging fire in society. Right after the service, I had a gentleman come up to me in the right after the first service, he came up to me and he said, are you aware that Scottsdale is becoming the premier city, the preeminent city for the treatment of sex addiction to pornography? I didn't know that. He said there's a place about a mile down the road that specializes in treatment. It's becoming well known all over the country. Now, when Jesus comes on the scene, he's full of grace and he's full of truth. And because he loves people, he enters into these really difficult conversations, and he's willing to say, hey, the very thing that you think is going to fulfill you is the very thing that has wrapped its claws around you and is beginning to dig into your life and consume your heart. And this isn't going to end well. There's a false sense of intimacy happening in your life right now, and you're feeding it. And that's going to take away from all healthy relationships that you have. And I love you enough to speak this truth into your life in a gracious way. And that's the beautiful thing about a redemptive community, is that someone can come up after the service and say, that is me. And by the grace of God, I'm getting the proper help. And all along the way, people are just sort of lifting my head up so that I can see Jesus and keep my focus on Jesus. And so when Jesus says the world cannot hate you to his brothers, what essentially he's saying is, you can't be hated because you don't believe in me. And since you don't believe in me, you're not going to follow in my footsteps. So you're swimming with the stream or the current of culture. And it's very easy to do. All you have to do is step into that current and you will be carried away. And so trying to swim upstream, that's when it becomes difficult. I want you to take a second, and I want you to picture in your minds the quintessential secular person. Just picture that face in your minds. Quintessential secular person. You got it? All right, here's who I think of. Now, right now you're thinking, where is he going with this? To be worldly is to want what you want when you want it immediately. Immediate gratification. Is this not what it means to be a child? Try taking away an infant's bottle, and that infant will seethe with rage. Not knowing how to speak a word, not knowing how to form sentences, that baby is communicating something to you. And that rage would be absolutely murderous. If that little creature wasn't so tiny, we'd be in trouble. If you're a parent, you can relate to this, right? I know parents, and when I say I know parents, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm talking about myself, okay? I know parents that have a child, and this child, when he was little, loved to eat chalk. And the parents would say, you keep eating that chalk, buddy, and you're going to be sick. You're going to be sick. And the kid would eat it and eat it and eat it and would make himself sick. And he just didn't care. He just had this desire to eat chalk. And so what did he do? He tried to hide it. He'd go underneath his little swing set, underneath the slide, and he'd eat that chalk. Now, this child had an affinity for that thick sidewalk chalk. You know what I'm talking about? That thick stuff? But he could never really hide it well because this kid had only 2 teeth. And those teeth were like SpongeBob. And when he would eat that piece of chalk, you could just see these teeth marks right in it. And almost every little piece of chalk that kid had, you could see he'd been eating on it. What's a parent trying to do? I'm trying to help you. I care about you. And what's the child thinking? I don't care. Don't eat that whole candy bar. You're going to make yourself sick. I don't care. I want it now. Now, I use that, and we all look at it and we think, you know what? Pat the kids on the head. That's what kids do. There's this story in the Old Testament about this guy named Esau. And he's super hungry. And he says, I'll trade my inheritance for a bowl of stew. Just like that. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but have you ever been impulsive? What time is it? You know, have you ever thought, oh, I just have to have this, and I have to have it now. And if I don't get it, I'm not going to be happy, joyful, or complete. See, herein lies the massive difference. You want to know how to tell the difference between a Christian and someone who's worldly? Here it is. The Christian does not live for the here and now. The Christian lives today in light of eternity. Another way of saying worldly is to use the word secular. It comes from the Latin word secule, which refers to a 70, 80, 90-year time period. Essentially, one lifetime. So secular people live for the now. One life is all I have. I'm going to live it to the fullest. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, boastful pride of life. If it feels good, I'm going to do it. If it looks good, I'm going to do it. If it has anything to do with boosting my ego, I'm going to pursue it. And Jesus says, to be a Christian is to take a completely different outlook on things. So this affects everything at the highest levels. Let's say you're part of a business and that business is secular, and you know what you want to do is you decide, hey, we want to be generous. We want to be a generous business. And so what we're going to do is we're going to donate 1% of all of our profits to some worthwhile charity. Meanwhile, in the back room, the discussion goes like this: as long as it makes us a greater profit. As long as it makes us a greater profit. If we can pull people in and make them think they're being generous, and the bottom line is that as long as it boosts our bottom line, this is a good plan. But if it doesn't work, let's not do it. Meanwhile, you're a Christian and you have $100 in your possession. How do you invest it? You have one of two decisions, really, right? You can invest it in things that are temporary, or you can invest it in things that will last forever, like people. The souls of people, that's what lasts forever. And so what it comes down to is your outlook will be, you will either love money and use people, or you will love people and use money to do that. Two very different outlooks in life. And when you choose to live your life like this, there will be people who look at you and say, what are you thinking? Don't be surprised. Jesus would say, don't be surprised if you do this. And people totally don't understand you. So I have a neighbor who's from Europe, and he moved in the neighborhood several years ago. Really liked this guy, really good guy. We become really good friends. But being from Europe, you know, the cathedrals in Europe, at one time, those things were full. You realize that, right? They were filled. But now people go into cathedrals to go, wow, look at that stained glass. And then they leave. Could it be that the churches or mega churches of America are soon to be the cathedrals of Europe? So he asked me a question. He said, explain this to me. What do you do? And I said, well, I'm a pastor and I teach the Bible. And he's kind of like, well, what do you produce? You know, it's a great question. You know, he's looking at me like, well, what do you contribute to society, you know? And so I said, well, this is kind of what the church does. And I said, we're a real humanitarian force in the community and these kinds of things, and we help people in various ways. And he was still kind of like, well, what do you do? What do you produce? He's a big-time contractor. And then he said, well, what does the church do to generate revenue? Where's the money come from? And I said, well, you're not going to believe this, but people actually give generously. They just give generously. He looked at me like I was wearing clown makeup. Had no idea, no context for that. Side note, since then, God has been doing some amazing things in his life. He has yet to come to church, but his family members have been to church. God's doing something there. He just had no framework. He couldn't understand it. I think he looks at me and he thinks, what value do you contribute to society? Jesus goes on to say, there are consequences to going against worldliness or rejecting secularism. And Jesus points it out in verses 2-7. What he says to his brothers is, you can't be hated. You can't be hated because you don't believe in me. And because you don't believe in me, you're not following in my footsteps. And so therefore, there is no collision course between you and the culture or you and society. But it's coming. And so this is quite frankly, friends, where it gets a little unpleasant, because this is a very revealing subject. But I think we need to understand where we're at on this one. Jesus says this in 1 John 3, do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. Don't be surprised. So why is it that we shouldn't be surprised? He actually tells us why in the very next verse. He says, you see, don't be surprised because Cain hated Abel. What does that mean? We should not be like Cain, who was the evil one, and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. How did Cain come to this murderous intent? Because his deeds were exposed by Abel's righteousness. Whoa. Don't be surprised if the world hates you. You see what Jesus is saying? Your goodness will shine the light on others' badness. To be a Christian is to illuminate the life of Jesus. And what happens is when you shine that light, you expose what's in the darkness. And those who are in the darkness, they don't want to be exposed. And so they'll end up hating you. Your truth exposes error. Your holiness declares others' depravity. And in that sense, your life stands in judgment of them in that it convicts them of their guilt and it shows them what God expects. And even though we're far from perfect, so much of this is revealed and plays itself out in our culture. Jesus was both for the world and against the world. So we should probably note that in the last 20, 30 years, churches that have traditionally fallen under the umbrella of evangelicalism, some of them have redefined biblical sin. And essentially what they've done is they've abandoned it. And they've been applauded. It's about time. It's about time that the church got in step with the culture. It's about time the church realized what it's like to live in modern society, as if it's the job of the church to keep up with the latest market trends. I like how one pastor put it. He said it would be like telling the EPA that humans everywhere are committed to pollution. So why should they call people to account if everyone is doing it? Well, the environment really is being destroyed by pollution. So the EPA does have the right to hold people and businesses accountable. So there is another form of pollution destroying people, and the Bible refers to it as sin. So to say the church has got no right to hold up the word of God and make people aware of sin and then offer the solution, well, that's just inconsistent. And here's the real problem. Without some kind of outside good and righteous lawgiver, humans will always be at a loss to agree on what is right, moral, and good. For example, not too long ago, a commencement speech was given at an Ivy League school, and one of the faculty gets up and says, it's obvious as we look at the culture and as we look at the world, we are losing respect for one another. We are losing respect for our fellow man. So what we need to do is we need to bring values back into the educational system. We need to start teaching morals again. And one student stood up and said, whose values? Whose morals? And that student was applauded. And the teacher had no response. Why? Because he subscribed to the same world view. Bertrand Russell was lecturing all throughout different parts of Europe, right about the same time that Hitler was rolling across Europe. And there was a collection, a book that was actually published with the title, Why I'm Not a Christian. And it was a collection of Bertrand Russell's essays. And one of the points he makes is, we don't need a God. We don't need something outside of humanity to tell us what's right and what's wrong. We can decide that for ourselves. Look out your window. Do you see those tanks rolling across Europe? Hitler's doing that in the name of morality. Along with millions of Germans, it was the moral thing to extinguish millions of Jews. They were a blight on society. Let's get rid of them. It's the right and moral thing to do. Can we please be intellectually honest for once in these conversations? Let's be intellectually honest and let's really search our own hearts. The problem is not with God. The problem is with the heart of man. So whatever defense you want to throw up, the truth always tears it down. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, he says, I'm full of grace and truth. And that's why I'm speaking truth to the culture and to the world. And what I'm saying is, what you're involved in will be to your own undoing. And I love you. In fact, you think me an enemy? I will do my best to make you my friend because I will die for you. That's the power of the gospel and the cross. Jesus was always doing things the wrong way. And for that, he was criticized and chastised. Born in the wrong place, to the wrong people, the wrong town. Jesus says, that's right. I don't do things the world's way. I don't think the way the world thinks. And because of that, I'm hated. And if you start living an eternity-centered life, then at times you will be hated too. Let me end by saying this. There are some Christians that are just constantly and always hated. And that's why, and the reason why is because they're obnoxious. Right? I mean, there are those Christians that are constantly being hated. And the reason why is because they're obnoxious or rude, and that needs to change. On the other hand, if we're never being persecuted or rejected, or there's a sense that we're an outcast in some way, then it could be that we're cowards. So what the scriptures do in this text, while not being easy, it helps us determine honestly, am I living a worldly life? And if you can answer that question easily by saying, oh yeah, it's happening to me. I just don't know how to take it and how to respond. Let me end with this, Matthew 5. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice. Wow. Rejoice and be glad. Why? Because your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Rejoice. Why? Your reward is great. You can't even imagine what is to come in the life to come. Think about being rewarded by the author and creator and sustainer of all life, and he wants to reward you. That is going to be a reward beyond what you can even think or fathom. And for those of you who are here, and you're here alone, you're here, your family isn't here, maybe a spouse, maybe even your kids, and they just don't get it. They just don't understand. They don't understand why you'd waste your time coming here. And be encouraged. You're in really, really good company. Jesus' own family members didn't believe in him. And if you think, if only I was a better person, Jesus was pretty good. Pretty good. And his family still rejected him. You're in good company. And for those of you who are stuck with one foot in the world and maybe one foot in this door, can I just tell you what you're missing out on? Why would you sell yourself short? And the very thing that you've been searching for your whole life is going to be found in the person of Jesus Christ. That's why he had the audacity to say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. There's no other way. And if I said there was another way, you'd pursue it and you'd be disappointed. So Father, our desire is for these words to sink deeply within. Father, for those of us that need the challenge, God, may we accept it and embrace it. May we live lives of confident assurance and faith as we follow in the footsteps of Jesus. For those who don't know you, but you're tugging, pray that their hearts would continue to be molded and shaped, that you would continue to speak to them. Let them be overwhelmed by your love, by your compassion, by your goodness. We pray this in your Son's name, and his name is Jesus Christ, and God's people said, amen.